Think back carefully to the last time there was a highly contagious virus going around in your immediate environment, perhaps at your busy office, within your own family, or even just around your neighborhood. And if you recall those events, you'll probably remember that some specific people got quite sick while many others didn't. Yet, despite the different outcomes, absolutely all of them were breathing the exact same air. And every single one of them was exposed to the very same germ. Some got sick and others didn't. Why? And now I'm going to ask you a second question. Also, think about the last time you took an antibiotic. You probably spent 1 or 2 weeks taking something so powerful that it not only killed the germ attacking you, but also wiped out millions of bacteria from your microbiota, your gut flora. And those beneficial bacteria had spent many long years working tirelessly for you, protecting your health and carefully training your immune system, but the strong medication unfortunately killed them all, your harmful enemies and your loyal allies alike. And even so, the original problem often comes back, or perhaps another dangerous germ appears and you find yourself getting sick all over again. You've probably heard that you shouldn't overuse antibiotics because then germs can become resistant to the medication. You've heard it, surely you have, and you're also used to hearing it and probably never questioned it, but doesn't it seem to you that if that's the case, maybe this antibiotic solution isn't so great after all? Why does the illness come back? And the answer to all these questions is the same. And what's more, it's been buried for 150 years. Because it turns out that the medicine we've inherited isn't built on the best available science. It's built on the science that was easiest to patent. But there was a man, a brilliant scientist, who proved, thank you, that choosing this specific path was a monumental mistake, and quite interestingly, he was completely erased from the pages of history. Today, I am standing here to tell you the absolute truth, and I can personally assure you that once you finally finish listening to what I have to say, you will never look at the concept of illness in the same way ever again. But before we begin going into much greater detail about the fascinating and tragic story of this forgotten scientist, I would first like to make a very important point. A reflection with you, because I understand it's essential, and you will too, for me, that you understand that what I'm about to talk to you about is very likely already affecting you directly today. And you'll agree with me that the story I'm about to tell you is much more valuable to you if you first recognize something of it in your own body. You see, I'm going to talk to you about 3 signs, 3 situations that you may have experienced or may be experiencing right now, and that probably no one has ever explained to you from the right perspective. Inflammation, repeated susceptibility, or what many call low immunity, and third, almost perfect lab results, but persistent problems that the doctor does not identify for you. The first sign is inflammation, especially the kind that doesn't have a clear explanation. That is, I'm not talking about the acute pain you feel when you hit yourself or break something. No, I'm referring specifically to that other kind of inflammation that's more silent and persistent, the fatigue that doesn't go away. Even when you are trying to get a good night's rest, that specific joint that consistently aches, and yet you don't know any apparent reason for the pain, or perhaps your skin is suddenly irritated and there's no obvious cause that you can point to, or even your digestive system, which for quite some time now just never seems to work quite right no matter what you try. If you've gone to the doctor for any of these things and they've given you an anti-inflammatory, then you've experienced germ theory medicine firsthand, applied to your body. You told them you had an annoying symptom, and what the doctor does is simply turn it off with a painkiller or an anti-inflammatory, and from there, life goes on. But it turns out that symptom was telling you something, and it's serious that no one was able to identify that message. but from my point of view, it's even more serious. That no one has taught you how to listen to and interpret that signal. The second sign is repeated susceptibility. In other words, are you the one who always gets sick first? Are you the one who catches everything that's going around? The one who takes longer to recover than everyone else? If that's the case, you've probably heard people say that you have low defenses. It's a phrase that sounds like an explanation, but in reality, it doesn't explain anything to you. It's to give you an example, like telling someone that their car won't start because the engine is off. The truth is, it's probably not that you have low defenses. What's much more likely is that your biological terrain isn't in the condition it needs to be to defend itself on its own. And the third sign is the most frustrating of all, the one that leaves you the most confused. It turns out your test results come back fine, perfect, and the doctor tells you that you're healthy, but you go home knowing that there's something there that doesn't add up. That there's something that isn't working as it should, but no number on any piece of paper can tell you what it is. For me, if it helps you as comfort or as an experience, this happened to me recently with my bacterial infection in the heart. 3 times I went to the emergency room at 3 different hospitals, and 3 times they sent me home with a diagnosis of, you know what? It's probably just a cold. Your test results are perfect. Now, that is exactly what I would call a significant voltage problem. And the issue is that voltage simply doesn't show up in a standard routine blood test, primarily because absolutely no one ever measures it. It is not simply because it doesn't exist, but because the medical systems and traditions we have inherited were never originally designed or constructed to look for it, and certainly not even to measure it. If any of these 3 specific warning signs happen to sound familiar to you, what you are about to hear next is not just the remarkable story of a long-forgotten and overlooked scientist. It is the deep explanation for exactly why your body has been desperately crying out for help for years, in a very specific way that absolutely no one has been able to hear until now. I'll also show you exactly how you can begin to change that, starting right now. Alright, so now, come with me to France, to Paris 175 years ago. Let's travel to the year 1850. While half the world was dying of cholera, tuberculosis, and fevers that no one could explain, 2 French scientists were engaged in a rivalry that went far beyond science. One of them was Louis Pasteur. His name probably sounds familiar to you. In fact, you'll see it's engraved in the process we use to preserve milk, pasteurization. It's also in your children's textbooks, and it was probably in yours too. And it's also on the facades of universities all over the world. He was a trained chemist, a genius at communication, and also the favorite of the government and the press of his time. He was a man who knew exactly how to speak to those in power and how to speak to those with money. And the other was Antoine Béchamp. This name most likely doesn't ring any bells for you. And as you'll see next, that's no coincidence. Béchamp was a doctor, pharmacist, and biologist. A man with 3 doctorates. A man who would spend entire years looking through a microscope before saying a word. Someone who, when he said something, had checked it to exhaustion. Both Pasteur and Béchamp were trying to understand the same thing. Why do we get sick? And both came to radically different conclusions. The problem here is that humanity chose the one who was wrong. Pasteur proposed something that was elegant in its simplicity. He explained that diseases originate from the external environment. That means there are germs floating in the air, and they enter your body and kill you. This is what we call the germ theory. And in terms of scientific narrative, it was actually perfect. Society and human beings had a problem, and to solve it, there was a hero, the doctor who eliminates the invader, and a villain, the microbe. And Pasteur proposed a clear solution: arm yourself and kill the villain. Remember that. The world at that time was experiencing the great boom in the use of gunpowder weapons, and everyday newspapers featured stories from the American Wild West. What weapon did Pasteur propose to use to kill the villain? Very simple: chemistry. Moreover, his proposal was presented as an invitation to progress and to research. Béchamp, however, proposed something much more uncomfortable. He said, disease does not come from outside. There are no external invaders that decide on their own whether you get sick or not. What determines whether you get sick or not is the state of your internal biological terrain. Béchamp was not interested in the germ. He was interested in the soil in which that germ grew or died. Notice the difference, because in reality it's a huge difference. If Pasteur is right, the solution is to kill germs. What you need is a weapon, and that weapon is manufactured, patented, and sold. It's a perfect business. If Béchamp is the one who's right, the solution is to take care of your terrain. And it turns out that the terrain can't be patented. You can't charge someone for having a healthy intestine, quality water, or a peaceful nervous system. And that's the root of everything that came afterward. To understand Béchamp, I'm going to explain to you, in simple terms, what he discovered was so disturbing for the science of his time that it took decades before they even tried to refute it. And you'll see, not because what he said was false, but because it was inconvenient. Antoine Béchamp dedicated many long years of his life to working within his laboratory, studying something he called microzymas, which were incredibly tiny, ultra-microscopic living particles that he found present in all living tissues, within the bloodstream, inside various internal organs, in natural ferments, and even in decaying matter wherever there was life to be found. He believed these microzymas were the fundamental building blocks of all biological existence. And up to this point, it's interesting but not revolutionary. What was revolutionary was what he observed next. It turns out that these particles were not static, they were not fixed. They changed, they transformed, and they did so depending on the environment in which they lived, and based on that, they took on completely different forms. Within a perfectly healthy and balanced environment, these elements were completely harmless, performing their tasks silently and efficiently while causing no harm at all. However, when the surrounding environment deteriorated and broke down, and when the internal conditions shifted significantly, those very same particles could simply undergo a transformation to become harmful bacteria. Pathogenic. You see, imagine the pieces of a magnetic construction set. If the ground is dry and clean, those pieces stay still, forming an orderly and useful structure. But if that same ground is flooded with mud and acidity, the pieces reorganize themselves, assemble in a different way, and become a barricade of pathogenic bacteria. It's not that the mud brings bacteria from outside. What has happened is that the dirty environment has forced your own biological building blocks, the microzymas, to change shape in order to survive. And that's what we call pleomorphism. But in Béchamp's time, this was considered outright scientific heresy, because what it did was prove that the enemy wasn't outside, but rather in the quality of the internal environment. And now, just think about what that implies. If germs are not external invaders with a fixed identity, but rather forms that life takes on depending on the environment it inhabits, then it turns out that the entire germ theory of Pasteur starts to wobble. And with it, the whole massive industry that was being built on top of it. The profound and far-reaching consequence of what I'm telling you today is that it's no longer simply a matter of asking the question of how to kill the germ, but rather why my internal environment has become a place where that germ can survive, grow, and ultimately thrive. Now just stop and think about it, the way a professional engineer would. If you find mold on the wall of your house, you can paint over it. The mold disappears for a few weeks, but then it comes back. He always comes back. And why? It's very simple, because you haven't solved the real problem. There is dampness on the wall of your house. Structural condition that makes that fungus find its perfect home there. And painting over it doesn't solve the problem, it only hides it. If you focus on that image, you have a perfect summary of what we've been doing with antibiotics for 150 years. Béchamp. He understood it 170 years ago and paid a very high price for having understood it. But you see, this is where the story gets truly dark, because it turns out that Béchamp didn't lose the debate because of science. Far from it, science was on his side. What he lost was the political and economic battle, and that. In the world of science, that's usually enough to erase you from the map. But you see, what very few people know is that Béchamp was not alone. Pasteur didn't have to silence just one scientist, he had to silence three. Three men who, from completely different angles, were arriving at the same conclusion. A conclusion that was also disturbing, that disease does not come from outside, that the internal environment is everything. You already know the first one. It was Béchamp with his microscope and his Microzymas. The second was Claude Bernard. I'm sure this name doesn't ring a bell either, and that's certainly no coincidence. Bernard. He was a physiologist and is considered by many, even today, the father of modern experimental medicine. His contribution is perhaps the one with the most practical consequences for you today. It turns out that Bernard developed the concept of the internal environment. His idea was seemingly simple, but profoundly revolutionary. The cells in your body do not live in a vacuum. They live submerged in a fluid, and that fluid must remain in constant balance with a specific temperature, a specific pH, and a specific concentration of minerals so that the cells can function properly. If that balance is disrupted, the cells become ill. And this happens not because an invader arrives, but simply because the environment they live in no longer allows them to function properly. Bernard called this homeostasis. And with this concept, what he was doing was saying exactly the same thing as Béchamp, but from the perspective of physiology instead of cellular biology. Two dedicated scientists, working in two entirely different disciplines. The same conclusion. And the most uncomfortable thing for Pasteur in Bernard's case is that Bernard was not a distant enemy to him. He was a close colleague, someone with whom Pasteur shared conversations, debates, and also scientific recognition. Ignoring Béchamp was relatively easy for Pasteur, but ignoring Bernard was much more difficult. And now let's move on to the third one. The third was René Quinton. And Quinton was the one who took the step that the others hadn't taken. What he did was take the terrain theory and bring it into clinical practice. Quinton was a biologist and physiologist, and he asked himself a question that, in his time, it sounded like absolute madness. He said, he wondered if life originated in the ocean and our cells have spent millions of years evolving bathed in that marine environment. Could it be that the internal environment of our body is nothing more than a version of that same primordial ocean? Quinton observed something that no one had ever stated so clearly before. It turns out that the composition of human blood plasma is extraordinarily similar to that of seawater. It contains the same minerals and in the same proportions, and it also shares the same electrochemical environment. From there, what he did was reach a conclusion that connected directly with Bernard and with Béchamp. And he said, if the body is like an aquarium and what keeps the fish alive is not attacking their enemies but maintaining the water in the right conditions, then medicine should worry less about killing germs and more about restoring the quality of the internal environment. And he didn't just stay in the realm of theory. What he did was prove his hypothesis, and in a way that no one could easily ignore. He took a dog, extracted almost all of its blood, and replaced it with treated seawater, diluted to have the same concentration as human plasma. According to the logic of the germ theory, that dog should have died within minutes, but that wasn't the case. They said, it will end up without blood, without red blood cells, without antibodies, it will die in minutes. It didn't die, it recovered, and its body regenerated the blood using that isotonic seawater as the scaffold. The experiment was an absolute scandal. Moreover, it was a scientific scandal of the highest order because it was also reproduced and documented. And above all, it was impossible to ignore. But Quinton went even further. What he did was open dispensaries in Paris where he treated children who were dying from malnutrition and infectious diseases. These were children whom conventional medicine had completely abandoned, had written off as lost. He treated them with a single tool. Quinton gave them isotonic seawater, and he administered it directly to their bodies to restore the conditions of their delicate internal environment. And the results were extraordinary. Thousands of children recovered, and everything was documented and published. Béchamp had the theory from the microscope. Bernard had the theory from physiology. And Quinton had the clinical evidence with documented human results. 3 fronts, 3 disciplines, the same conclusion. And it was then, with all that on the table, when we reach the most uncomfortable moment in this story. Louis Pasteur was aware of the work of all 3. He knew Bernard personally, interacted with him regularly, was familiar with Béchamp's microzymas, and knew about Quinton's dispensaries and the children Quinton was saving. In his personal laboratory journals, he wrote things that did not become public until decades after his death. Pasteur's family guarded these files closely, but when researchers were finally able to examine them, they found something no one expected. There are historical notes in which Louis Pasteur finally acknowledged that, in reality, the biological terrain was what truly mattered, and that the presence of the germ alone could not possibly explain everything on its own. Pasteur knew it, with Béchamp's theory before him, with Bernard's physiology at his side, with the children saved by Quinton as irrefutable clinical evidence. He knew it, but he chose to remain silent. He hid it, and on his deathbed, in his final moments, he whispered something that summed up decades of deliberate silence. What he said was, the germ is nothing, the terrain is everything. Bernard was right. His friend Claude Bernard had been telling him this for years, but he never listened. And in the end, he died with that truth on his lips. But the industry kept choosing to forget it because the germ theory, as it turns out, was marketable, while the biological terrain, as I mentioned before, can't be patented. You can't charge someone for having a healthy gut, for having quality water, or for having a peaceful nervous system. So Béchamp was erased. Bernard was reduced to a footnote in some studies, and Quinton, the man who had saved thousands of children from death with seawater, saw how his dispensaries were closed one by one as the nascent pharmaceutical industry gained ground. It wasn't something violent, it wasn't something dramatic, it was simply the logic of money applied to science. And that's what is called official history. The 3 who were left out are called forgotten. Well, now let's go down to the deeper level where all of this stops being mere history and becomes your actual biology. Because what Béchamp, Bernard and Quinton described from their laboratories and dispensaries is actually happening inside you right now at this very moment. As you listen to me, you see, just imagine your body as what it truly is. A genuine, complex and incredibly vibrant ecosystem. Think of the trillions of cells working in harmony, maintaining a delicate balance that reflects the ancient wisdom of these great scientists. In other words, you are not a sterile tube into which germs enter from the outside. You are a planet inhabited by trillions of microorganisms. Right now, as you listen to me, it turns out you have more bacteria in your body, thank you, than your own cells. And this is not an anomaly, nor is it a disease. Illness is simply part of our design as human beings. And the question that Béchamp asked was the right one. What makes those microorganisms your allies or your enemies? The answer is the terrain. And this is where Bernard comes into the picture again. Because you see, the terrain is not an abstract idea. It has concrete and measurable parameters. It has voltage, it has pH, it has oxidation and reduction levels, it has structured water with the proper mineralization, it has temperature, and it has electrolytes in the correct proportions. When those parameters are in order, the microorganisms living inside you easily work for you. They produce vitamins, protect your gut, train your immune system, and produce neurotransmitters that directly affect your mood. But when those parameters deteriorate, those same organisms end up changing their behavior and do so. Not because invaders have come from outside, but simply because the environment they live in has changed. And they have to adapt to that new environment, which is exactly what Bishop observed in his microcosms. And here is the question that germ theory medicine has never been able to answer well. In a widespread epidemic, there will always be people who become sick and those who do not. And everyone is in the same environment and breathes the same air. The question I asked you at the beginning of the video, are they exposed to the same germ? What is it that makes them different? Very simple, the internal environment of each person. Just remember Quinton's aquarium. If the water is in the right condition, the fish live without any problems. But if the water deteriorates, the fish, they get sick and die. And this isn't because an external enemy arrives, but because the environment they live in simply no longer allows them to function normally. And the germ was present in both cases, but it was the environment that made the difference. And now notice something that I think is fundamental. Modern science, although it rarely mentions Béchamp, Bernard, or Quinton by name, is actually reaching exactly the same conclusions today. Only now, it calls it by another name. When medicine talks about the microbiota today, what it is really doing is talking about the ecosystem that Béchamp described. When it talks about systemic inflammation, what it is really doing is referring to the internal environment that Bernard studied. And when it talks about serums and intravenous rehydration with electrolytes, it is using the principle that Quinton already demonstrated with his children in Paris 150 years ago. But all three were erased. Their ideas were not. The ideas survived disguised under new names because you see, the truth, when it is solid enough, does not disappear. At most, it just changes its clothes. And this brings us to the most important question of this entire video. If the terrain is everything, if what determines whether you get sick or not is the state of your internal environment, then what can you do tomorrow morning to start taking care of it? This is exactly what I am going to talk to you about now. And with this, we arrive at what, for me, is truly the practical heart of this entire video. because knowing that Béchamp was right is great. Knowing that Bernard confirmed it is also great. Knowing that from physiology is also great. And knowing that Quinton demonstrated it clinically with real children is even better. But you see, if all of that doesn't serve you for something concrete, tomorrow morning for you then, it's just an interesting story. So I invite you to join me on this journey, because we're going to get deeply practical and actionable. And what I'm going to give you right now is far more than just a simple collection of common wellness tips. It's precision engineering applied directly to your unique biological terrain, physics, chemistry, and physiology, seamlessly integrated and synthesized in a way that conventional medicine still hasn't fully adopted or understood. I'm going to give you 4 specific factors, 4 powerful levers, and concrete actions for each and every one of them. And the very first thing I want you to fully understand before we even start is something that might sound a bit provocative at first, but is actually based on pure, rigorous engineering. You see, the reality is that you simply can't buy a healthy biological terrain. You can buy antibiotics, you can buy anti-inflammatories, you can also buy supplements. But the biological terrain, your biological terrain, isn't sold at the pharmacy. It is built, maintained, or destroyed. And the decision about which of these 3 is happening in your body right now is one you make every day. With that, let's begin. The first lever is water. And here, Quinton left us the clearest lesson of all. The internal environment of your body doesn't need a large volume of water. What it needs is water with the specific and, moreover, correct mineral composition. Without that conductivity, the electrical signal of your cells simply degrades, the terrain becomes impoverished, and the microorganisms that Béchamp described begin to change form. What does this mean in practice? Well, there are 2 options that I use and recommend and that I've talked to you about in other videos. The first is isotonic water, the same one Quinton used to restore the internal environment of his sick little children. And the preparation is very simple. 1 part seawater to 3 parts weakly mineralized mineral water. And look, it's important that the mineral water you use is weakly mineralized so you don't alter the proportions of minerals in the seawater. What this mixture needs to do is replicate the composition of human plasma, and it is literally about giving the aquarium back the water it needs. The second simplest option for everyday use is to add virgin sea salt from salt flats to your water, but do not add refined salt or the kind you buy at the supermarket. It has to be virgin salt with its minerals intact. And as you already know, we've talked about this in depth on the channel on other occasions. This salt is not just a seasoning, although it is that too, but above all, it is the electrolyte that allows your biological antenna to resonate. And here is a specific action I recommend to start your day. Take your water, whether isotonic or with sea salt, accompanied by the juice of 1 or 2 lemons. And I know it might seem contradictory to add something acidic to balance your system. And now you'll understand why it's not when I talk to you about pH. The second lever is pH. And here it's important to make a distinction that very few people know about, but it's fundamental to avoid confusion. You see, for years we've heard that the body should be alkaline and that acidity is the enemy, that what we need to do is alkalize. And it turns out that, like so many other oversimplifications, it's only a half-truth that can end up leading you in the wrong direction. Forget about the trend of alkalizing your body as if you were a swimming pool, because physics doesn't work that way. And here let me clarify something for you. There are 2 types of pH that matter and that you shouldn't confuse. On one hand, there's the pH of the blood, which is extraordinarily stable. Your body regulates it with millimetric precision between 7.35 and 7.45. And if it shifts even a little from that range, the consequences for you can be very serious. Your body will do whatever is necessary to keep it within that range. And this pH, the one in your blood, you are not going to change it with what you eat. And then there's the pH of your urine. That's a different story. That one does reflect the acid-base state of your metabolism, and that's something you can measure and monitor. You can find the tests available at any pharmacy. And that pH will indeed give you useful information about the state of your internal environment. You see, in the end, what's important here is to understand that pH is nothing more than something like the water pressure in your pipes, your biological pipes. If your internal environment is loaded with processed sugar or cortisol, the pressure will drop and your body becomes acidic. And in an acidic environment, electrical conductivity plummets. Your cells can no longer maintain their voltage of minus 70 millivolts. And this is pure physics. Without the correct pH, your battery runs out. And that's why lemon and virgin sea salt are not just old wives' remedies. They are the master electrolyte that cleans the rust from your wires, so that energy can flow again. Lemon juice is acidic outside the body, obviously it is, but when you metabolize it, it has an alkalizing effect on your metabolism. And this is one of those seemingly paradoxical actions that biochemistry explains perfectly. And water with sea salt and lemon as your first drink of the day. Thank you. It is one of the simplest and most effective ways to start taking care of your body's acid-base balance. Well, now let's move on to the third lever, cellular voltage. This is the most overlooked by conventional medicine and at the same time the most important from the perspective of biological engineering. Every cell in your body has to maintain a membrane potential of approximately minus 70 millivolts, and this is not a trivial fact. This is the necessary condition for four fundamental things to occur: the transport of nutrients into the cell, the expulsion of waste out of the cell, proper cellular signaling, and adequate mitochondrial function. A damaged or inflamed cell loses that voltage, it becomes depolarized. And when it becomes depolarized, what happens is that it stops functioning properly. Therefore, recovering the electrical potential of your cells is, in very concrete terms, recovering cellular health. And you might say, hey, how is that done? Well, the first thing we've already addressed. The proper mineralization of water, the electrolytes, which are the conductors that allow that voltage to be maintained, because really, without minerals there is no conductivity, and without conductivity there can be no voltage. It's that straightforward. And the second is grounding, which I've also talked to you about on many occasions. Direct contact between your skin and the earth, that is, walking barefoot on grass, sand or soil. When your body touches the ground, two things happen simultaneously. On one hand, your excess positive charge, the one you've accumulated in your tissues, drains into the ground, balancing your electric field. And on the other hand, the earth provides you with electrons and infrared energy that help recharge your system. And now the third tool comes into play, infrared light from the sun, preferably at sunrise and during the early hours of the morning, when infrared is abundant and ultraviolet radiation is still low. If you can't access sunlight, there's the 850 nanometer infrared lamp. This is what can help you substitute for the sun in case you don't have access to it. You see, photons of that frequency are directly absorbed by the water in your cells and expand what Gerald Pollack called the exclusion zone, which is that layer of structured water that surrounds your proteins, your membranes, and your DNA, and which is what maintains electrical order within the cell. The consumption of mineralized water, the practice of grounding, and consistent exposure to infrared light. All three of these essential elements function synergistically in harmony toward the same ultimate goal: to effectively keep the cellular voltage within the specific range where biological life occurs properly and thrives. And with this, we come to the fourth lever. To remind you, the first is water, the second pH, and the third, which I just mentioned, is cellular voltage. The fourth lever is the nervous system. And this is the one that is most often ignored, and in my personal experience, the one that has the greatest consequences in practice. Here, I want you to think of your nervous system not as something psychological, but as what it really is from an engineering point of view, an electrical circuit. And for an electrical circuit like this, chronic stress is subjecting the circuit to a continuous tension that it cannot discharge. And what happens when an electrical circuit is permanently overloaded? It's very simple. It ends up failing. And in your biology, that failure doesn't happen in a wire. It happens in the voltage of your cells. Chronic stress erodes that minus 70 millivolts potential I mentioned, modifies the pH, alters the gut flora, increases intestinal permeability, and changes the conditions of the terrain. Exactly in the same direction that Béchamp described. In other words, toward the environment in which microorganisms will adopt their pathogenic form. And you see, I experienced this firsthand. I was on that stretcher with multiple organ failure and a medical director asking me about my last wishes because he didn't think I would make it to the next day. And I assure you, there wasn't any germ killing me. What there was a terrain completely scorched by the stress of watching myself and all my assets being stolen from me. And that caused such a brutal short circuit that the voltage of my membranes must have dropped drastically to that level of systemic collapse. Biophysics, what it tells us is that the voltage of the membranes drops. Thank you. Far below those necessary minus 70 millivolts, and mine must have dropped to levels of minus 20 millivolts or even lower. At that level of discharge, what your cells simply do is shut down the system. You stop functioning. And that's why I know, purely for survival, that if you don't recover your minus 70 millivolts through grounding, mineralized plasma, and infrared light, chemical medicine will only be changing fuses in a house that's actually burning down. What can you do specifically? It's very simple. The 3 previous levers are already part of the answer. Mineral water, grounding, and infrared light act directly on the nervous system because they are acting on the cellular voltage that sustains it. But there are also 2 more tools I want you to know about because they also act directly on the vagus nerve, which is ultimately the main regulator of the autonomic nervous system, and it's the one that decides whether your body is in defense mode or repair mode. The first of these tools is slow, deep breathing. When you breathe slowly, especially by extending the exhalation, you are regulating the carbon dioxide in your blood and sending a direct signal to your nerve, vagus, that tells it there is no danger here, so you can come out of alarm mode. Alarm. That is the fastest and most accessible reset that exists for your nervous system. And you don't need anything, just air and awareness. And the second is cold water at the end of your shower. I know this doesn't sound appealing to many, but from a biological engineering perspective, those 30 or 60 seconds of cold water are a direct command to your vagus nerve. What thermal contrast does is activate the parasympathetic branch of your nervous system, which is exactly the same one that triggers repair mode. Repair. Thank you. It reduces cortisol and lowers systemic inflammation. Therefore, slow breathing and cold water, 2 actions, 2 direct commands to the circuit that regulates your internal environment from your nervous system. Béchamp, Bernard, and Quinton left us the theory and the evidence. Now, the power and control are entirely in your hands. Allow me to conclude this session by sharing something that I believe is far more important than the entire story you've just heard. And it's a question, just one question. The very next time that you happen to fall ill, or perhaps someone you deeply care about becomes sick, instead of only asking yourself what specific germ it might be, what exactly is affecting them so negatively, or how we can effectively kill it off. Try adding this other profound question to your thoughts. What specific condition of my own internal biological environment has allowed this situation to happen right now? And please understand that asking that question does not replace modern medicine. I am certainly not telling you to ignore the professional advice of your doctor, or to refuse necessary medical treatment when you truly need it. Not at all. Conventional medicine possesses many incredible life-saving tools, and there are definitely times in our lives when you absolutely need to utilize them for your health. I myself have just spent a month in the hospital. What I'm telling you is something much more subtle and deeper. That you add that question. That you don't settle for just knowing the name of the germ and the molecule that's going to kill it. Ask yourself, because you see, if you kill the germ but the environment stays the same, the germ, it's very likely to come back. Or that another one will come and another after that. And besides, I'm sure you've experienced this, that what I'm telling you is something you know, but before you didn't realize it. Now you know why that happens. And now think about it from an engineering perspective. If every time a fuse blows in your house, you call the electrician to remove the blown fuse and put in a new one, but you never ask why that fuse keeps blowing, sooner or later what you'll end up with at home is a fire, because the fuse isn't the problem. The fuse is just the sign that something in the wiring isn't working as it should, and the germ is the fuse. Your body is the wiring, and the medicine we've inherited has spent 150 years changing fuses without ever looking at the wiring. Bishop saw it through his microscope. Bernard formulated it from physiology, and Quinton demonstrated it with the healthy lives of thousands of children who had been condemned to die in Paris. Pasteur knew it, wrote about it in private, and chose to keep it quiet. Today, you no longer have that excuse, because 21st century medicine, which is emerging in these months and these years, although it still struggles to pronounce the names of Béchamp, Bernard, and Quinton, is arriving at exactly these same conclusions. The microbiota, leaky gut, psychoneuroimmunology, epigenetics, all of these are different ways of saying the same thing that these three men said 170 years ago in the 19th century. The germ is nothing, it is the terrain that is everything. Pasteur knew it, but he kept quiet. And probably that's why it continues. I'm sick. But from today on, you already know what he also knew. And unlike him, you can do something with this information. You are the chief engineer of your own terrain, and no one else can be. If this video has been helpful to you, and you think it could be useful to someone you know, you would be doing me a big favor by sharing it, because you will help me spread knowledge. As I always tell you, go forward, always forward. And I'll read your comments. Thank you very much.